That living with my new husband Daniel and his son Gabriel would become far more challenging than just merging our lives together was something I never anticipated. Although it was one of the finest choices I had ever made, marrying Daniel brought about some unanticipated adjustments. Daniel was always abroad on business trips, so I was left spending a lot of time alone with my stepson. Gabriel had just turned 21 and was trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life after finishing school. There had been an almost too comfortable atmosphere between us. Being around him was easy, and we got along well. At first, I attributed this to Gabriel's thoughtfulness and maturity beyond his years. However, as time passed, I began to wonder if there was more going on, if there was something neither of us was willing to acknowledge. One morning, as I finished my morning routine in the bathroom and prepared for a quiet day alone in the house, Daniel was away on a work trip. The sound of the shower is still audible, and steam is curling up the mirrors. I was lost in my thoughts. I kept thinking back to the talk I had with Gabriel the previous evening. It had been simple enough, discussing his aspirations and future, but there was a look in his eyes and a reluctance that I couldn't quite get rid of. When I heard a tap on the bathroom door that morning as I was drying my hair at the sink, Gabriel's voice murmured softly, "You in there?" Believing that Gabriel didn't typically knock, I blinked. In the restroom, particularly at this early hour. I turned to face the door after glancing at my reflection. "Sure, I'm here, Gabriel. What is it up there?" He paused for a moment, and I heard him move across from me. "I apologize, but I have to go get something from the restroom. May I enter for a moment, please?" The steam made me pause. I was wrapped in a thin towel, my hair moist from the shower, and I was still holding on to the air, but Gabriel's voice seemed innocent enough, and he needed something, and that wasn't odd. "Sure," I said, attempting to seem informal, quickly. The door opened. "Please come in." Cautiously, and Gabriel entered. He looked at me and then hurried over to the cabinet. He was wearing sweatpants and had untidy hair like he had just woken up. Pretending to concentrate on drying my hair, I turned back to the mirror as he rummaged through it, trying to find whatever it was he wanted. However, I couldn't help but notice the change in the atmosphere between us. My heart raced as I heard him stop searching, yet it was subtle but unmistakable how he went around the room and how his eyes remained on me for a little bit longer than normal before he turned away. He held up a bottle of aspirin and said, "You got it," but instead of walking away, he stayed and kept looking at me. "You're getting ready for something, aren't you?" I looked at him and tried to pretend as though nothing was unusual, so I said, "No, just starting my day." He shrugged and leaned against the counter, and the tension in the room increased with every second. "I'm not sure how you look." The remark surprised me. I looked at him and thought, different. Gabriel swallowed, looked away for a moment, and then looked back at me. "I don't know. It's hard to explain." I'm still wrapped in my towel, and I met his gaze. There was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, an intensity, a curiosity that made my breath catch differently, and my voice was softer than I intended. The stillness between us was becoming thicker, and I stood there at a loss for words. The air seemed heavy and packed with an unsaid tension that I was unsure how to handle. This was Gabriel, my stepson. I shouldn't be feeling this way or trapped between trying to deny what was happening and accepting it. Before I could say anything, Gabriel moved in closer, reducing the gap between us. I watched him, not knowing what he was going to do, and my heart was thumping in my chest. He stopped a few steps away. His gaze lingered on mine for me. "If this seems strange, I apologize," he remarked. His speech was hardly audible above a whisper, but I've sensed lately, I'm not sure whether it's just me, that my breath caught. I was unsure of how to respond or articulate my thoughts. In all honesty, I had also sensed that momentous change in our connection, the way we seemed to be becoming closer in ways other than family. "I don't know what it is, Gabriel," but before I could continue, he moved closer and delicately brushed his palm across my arm. I began by trembling a little. Though hesitant and gentle, the contact sent me a shock of energy. Despite the excitement and astonishment, I looked up at him, my heart pounding, and recognized that we had stepped over a boundary that neither of us had foreseen but had been accumulating for some time. "Gabriel, I know this is wrong." "I can't help how I feel," he said, his hands still resting on my arm. I couldn't talk because the situation was so heavy, and all I could do was look at him. My mind was spinning with things I couldn't comprehend, like this was my stepson Daniel's son, yet there was no denying the bond between us and the pull I felt for him. I must leave, I said. I stepped back abruptly and broke eye contact, and my speech sounded unsteady. Additionally, I could sense my cheeks getting hotter. Gabriel gave a nod, his face showing. He said, "I'm sorry," pained. I had no intention of doing so. Trying to regain my composure, I said, "It's okay. We'll talk later," without waiting for a response. I slammed the door to my bedroom behind me and leaned against it, my heart thumping in my chest, my mind a swirl of bewilderment, remorse, and something more I wasn't ready to accept. I slid by him and raced out of the restroom. Just what had occurred? What had occurred so fast, and more importantly, what was I going to do now that I knew nothing concrete had happened yet, but I was in a complete daze? For the remainder of that day, I tried to act as though nothing had happened since I wasn't sure what to do. I distracted myself by doing housework, running errands, and anything else that would divert my attention from the bathroom encounter, but I was unable to get rid of the image of Gabriel standing so close to me, the sensation of his touch, or the unfamiliar expression in his eyes. This was not the intended situation. Daniel and Gabriel were my spouses. Was I my stepson's son? It was meant to be easy between us. Over time, our family dynamic shifted, and I didn't recognize the changes until it was too late. I spent the majority of the day by myself in the house because Daniel was out on one of his regular business trips and Gabriel had left soon after our encounter. The silence felt heavy, as though it were pressing down on me and making me face the truth of what had happened. I kept replaying the scene in my head. We had been so near, his comments had made my pulse beat, and I had felt the same irresistible pull toward him. By nightfall, the strain in my chest had only become worse. I hadn't heard from Gabriel all day, and I felt somewhat relieved. I couldn't tell. Another part of me, the part one was trying to ignore, missed him. I couldn't help but wonder where he was, what he was thinking, and whether he was experiencing the same confusion that I was. I was sitting on the couch with a half-empty glass of wine in my hand when I heard the front door open. My heart leaped into my throat, and I quickly put the glass down after trying to steady myself when Gabriel entered the living room. His face was inscrutable when he looked at me a few seconds later. We just stared at one another in silence for a while, and then he whispered softly, "The tension between us is thick and palpable." He spoke in a hesitant, gentle tone, as though he wasn't sure how to approach me. "Hey," I said, my voice tremulous. Suddenly feeling self-conscious, I got up, unsure if you would return tonight. His eyes darted to the window, and he answered, "Yeah, I just needed some air." There was something more in his expression that reflected how I felt, but he also appeared apprehensive, as if he wasn't sure what to say. I took a deep breath, my thoughts whirling. He wasn't the boy I'd met when I first married Daniel, and I would have liked to say something to make things better between us and get things back to normal, but instead I found myself staring at him, taking in the way his shirt clung to his chest and the way his dark hair fell slightly into his eyes. He had become a man, and it was hard to ignore him standing here in the calm of the living room. Gabriel stepped toward me, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his eyes focused on the floor. "I'm really sorry," he whispered. I didn't intend to confuse things with his voice. I had no idea what happened to me. I inhaled deeply while shaking my head. Even though my voice conveyed that I was anything but okay, I said, "It's okay." I wasn't expecting much from it. He nodded and looked up at me. His words made my spine tingle, and I felt my breath catch. I simply feel as though I am unaware of the situation, as if there is a barrier between us. I am aware that it is detrimental, trust me, I am conscious, but I am unable to prevent it. In my throat, I wanted to say anything to stop things from becoming worse, but the fact was that I couldn't refute what he was saying. There was a connection between us that had been developing for some time, but I had been too scared to admit it. I began nervously, "Gabriel, we're unable to. This is unable to occur. You are the son of Daniel, and I am aware that he was in anguish when he interfered. Everything is known to me. But it doesn't alter my feelings." As he moved closer to me, I could feel the heat emanating from him and the distance between us getting less by the second. With my heart pounding, I stood there, reaching out and taking his hand instead of him, even though I wanted to step away to put some distance between us. I was overcome with heat from the electric contact, which I couldn't ignore. I was gasping for air when I looked up at him, and I could see the same feelings reflected in his eyes, want and bewilderment. All of our guilt was exposed between us. "Gabriel, I don't want to hurt anyone," muttered, lightly stroking the back of my hand with his thumb, "but I can't act as though this isn't real." I took a deep breath, my mind racing with contradictory feelings. I knew he was correct, there was something genuine and indisputable between us, but this was wrong, wasn't it? Daniel was his father, and I was his stepmother. We couldn't accomplish this, but now that we were standing on the brink of something so strong and genuine, I knew I didn't have the strength to pull away as I stood there looking up at him and feeling his hand's warmth pushes my heart into overdrive. "I am unsure about what to do. We don't have to sort it all out right now," Gabriel remarked, as he moved closer and tightened his palm around mine as I mumbled something that was almost audible. "Gently, but we can't continue to act as if nothing's going on," his words lingered. We couldn't continue to act as though the tension between us had been growing for too long, and now that it was in the open, there was no turning back. I realized then that he was correct. Between us, heavy with the weight of everything we weren't saying, Gabriel moved in and gently brushed his lips against mine before I could respond. The kiss was timid and cautious, as though he was giving me an opportunity to back away, but I didn't, so I kissed him back with my hand. It moved to the back of his neck and drew him in. The kiss included all the feelings that had been growing between us, but were not yet expressed: shame, bewilderment, want, and something more profound that had the feel of love. While we were both breathing heavily and pressing our foreheads against one another as the reality of what we had just done set in, I didn't care at the time because I didn't know what it meant or where it would lead. Instead of feeling regret, I felt something else. I was relieved that we had finally stopped acting like we were at odds. Gabriel gazed down at me, his eyes displaying a range of emotions. "What should we do at this point?" he questioned softly, with a hint of doubt in his voice. When I stood there holding his hand, I realized that I didn't want to go back to the way things had been before, so I said, "This isn't over," without really knowing what I was saying. I added, "But we'll figure it out," because I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that things between us had changed, and there was no way to go back. He grinned, and I felt a wave of calmness sweep over me for the first time since that restroom morning. We would confront this together, and the narrative was far from over, so whatever it was, it would be. In the days that followed, Gabriel and I were enveloped in a haze of private moments, glances, and unsaid feelings. After that first kiss, we both knew we had crossed a line, but instead of feeling guilty or regretful, we felt a sense of relief, as if the tension that had been building between us for weeks had finally been released. However, that relief was accompanied by the unmistakable realization that our lives would never be the same because Daniel was still away on business, and having him gone meant that Gabriel and I were alone in the house more often. Less than not. Every touch and every grin felt full of unanswered questions, giving our quiet times together a new significance. How did this affect us? And where were we heading? And most all, how long could we conceal this information? A few days after that initial kiss, Gabriel and I were sitting on the back porch once more. The sun was lowering, bathing the yard in a gentle golden glow, and the air was still warm from the day's heat. We had developed a habit of spending our evenings outside, conversing about nothing. I could feel Gabriel's eyes on me, and when I turned to face him, he gave me a gentle, hesitant smile that made my heart race. I was sitting next to Gabriel, our knees touching, and we were enjoying each other's company in the kind of silence that only occurs when two people feel deeply connected. His voice was soft, hardly audible. "Naturally reluctant," I said, turning slightly to look at him. As if collecting his thoughts before responding, he glanced down at his hands. "Have you considered what this means? For us?" With my heart racing in my chest, I took a deep breath. It had been on my mind all the while, but I hadn't wanted to express it out. Refused to face the truth of what was occurring between us. Admittedly, I have spoken softer than I meant to. But whether I have any answers is a mystery to me. He gave a nod, his gaze still fixed on the floor. I simply don't want you to believe that this is a phase or anything. Even though I realize this is tricky, I care about you more than I probably should, and I can't help it." His words lingered thick in the air. The responsibility of what we had left unsaid gripped my throat. He was telling the truth, and it broke my heart. I cared more for him than I should have, but I was afraid of what that would imply for my marriage to Daniel and for us as a couple. "I care about you too," I replied softly, my voice shaking, "but Daniel is involved. It's not just about us. He is your father, and if he learned, Gabriel's jaw would have clenched." I knew I didn't want to harm him, but I also didn't want to act as though nothing was going on between us. He nodded. I bit my lip, struggling to speak. Everything between us seemed so strong and real, yet the repercussions were always looming in the background. The connection I had with Gabriel was so strong that I'm not sure what the proper course of action is, even though I didn't want to betray or upset Daniel. My voice was barely heard as I murmured, but I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. Gabriel gazed up at me, his eyes brimming with passion, anxiety, want, and hope. He carefully extended his hand and grabbed my hand, his fingers warming mine. I felt calmed and grounded by the simple touch, which brought me back to the present. He said, "We'll figure it out," gently stroking the back of my hand with his thumb. "Whatever this is, we've figured it out together." I nodded, my heart swelling with the assurance in his words. Everything became clearer in that moment. The fear, the confusion, the uncertainty, all of it vanished, replaced by a quiet realization that we didn't have all the answers, but we didn't need them. As the day turned to night, the sun sank lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. The only sound in the still air was the distant chirping of crickets. What mattered was that we were in this together, and that we cared about each other more than anything else. I felt at PRST time in a long time as I rested my head on Gabriel's shoulder and felt his chest rise and fall steadily with his breaths. However, as much as I wanted to linger in that moment, reality was always close by. In a few days, Daniel will return home, and I had a sensation of dread at the prospect of meeting him. Given what had transpired between Gabriel and myself, how could I bring myself to look him in the eye and act as though nothing seemed normal? It was hard to ignore the reality of our position, but Gabriel and I tried to make things lighthearted and avoid thinking about the future for the following several days. The guilt that accompanied it was beginning to weigh on me. One night, just one day before Daniel was scheduled to return, I found myself lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts, and I was unable to escape. The house was quiet, with only the soft hum of the air conditioner turning on and off, but I was unable to fall asleep because my thoughts kept returning to Gabriel and the ways he had touched me, kissed me, and made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. I knew I had to make a decision because I couldn't continue to live in this limbo, torn between my loyalty to Daniel and my feelings for Gabriel, but the prospect of losing one of them was too painful to bear. My pulse was pounding as I sat up. My heart sprang into my throat. It was Charlotte. Gabriel's voice. "Come in," I whispered gently, my voice shaking, and the door opened slowly. Gabriel entered with a serious expression on his face. The door was steady but silent. He shut the door behind him and proceeded to the bed, where he perched on the edge for a while. We sat there silently, the burden of all that we had not discussed weighing on us. He said, "I've been thinking. I understand that this is difficult," but he silently fixed his gaze on the ground when you spoke about Daniel and me. "It is not my intention to force you to make a decision." With my heart hurting, I swallowed hard. He abruptly blurted, "I love you, Charlotte," with genuineness in his voice. His voice was calm yet emotional, interrupting me. "I don't know how or when it happened, but I needed you to know that I love you. I know it's unfair to expect you to feel the same way," but his words sent a shockwave through my chest, making it momentarily impossible for me to breathe. Hearing him express his sentiments and acknowledge their intensity made everything seem more genuine, even if I had understood in my heart how he felt. I muttered, my words trickling out. "I love you too. I hope you do." Gabriel looked up at me before I could stop him, his eyes wide with astonishment. Heart thumping in my chest, I nodded. "Even though I do, this isn't any simpler." He was unsure of what to say, as evidenced by the stillness that followed. And I believed I had made up my mind at that moment. I let my eyes and the sheets open. In hindsight, I realized that my decision to ask him to join me was based more on emotion than logic, but at the moment, I didn't mind because he immediately understood and joined me. I leaned in to give him a kiss. I really allowed myself to go there because it was so incredible. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, his voice full of quiet determination. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." I understood that as quickly as it had begun and as quickly as it had ended, it must have been exciting for him. After a minute, he reached out and took my hand in his, and for a moment we just sat there holding each other's gaze, the weight of the world pressing down on us. The morning when Daniel came home seemed like the calm before the storm, even though I still knew I had to make a choice and understood the right response. The weight of the tension that had been growing between Gabriel and me was evident. We knew that things would have to change once Daniel returned, but we hadn't figured out how we were more than just a stepmother and stepson. We had entered a new world of complex emotions, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it was always there, looming. Daniel's return was marked by a warm hug, a cheek kiss, and the typical routine of catching up on the few days we had been apart. He seemed utterly unaware of the quiet tension that existed between Gabriel and me, his normal, cheerful self, bringing a sense of normalcy to the house, but beneath that facade, I felt as though I was being choked. Every look Gabriel and I shared was weighed down by the issues we hadn't yet resolved, and after dinner that night, with Daniel back in the picture, the complexity of our predicament felt even more overwhelming. "We could all gather in the living room to catch up," Daniel offered. Gabriel was sitting across from me, his eyes darting toward mine, and I tried to force a smile as I sat down on the couch, my heart pounding. However, there was no space for conversation between us, especially since Daniel was there discussing his trip and all the work he had to catch up on. I could hardly concentrate, and Daniel eventually excused himself to call for work. Gabriel shuffled uneasily in his chair, his fists clenched together as if he were trying to stop himself from reaching out to me. With the stillness that followed, which was deafening, none of us spoke for a time. With the guilt still nagging at me, I looked down. "I understand, but it is unfair to Daniel for us to continue doing this behind his back. He's not worthy of this." Gabriel looked up at me and stopped pacing. "Where are you? We must find a solution because we cannot continue to live in this state of uncertainty." I took a deep breath as I spoke, the words that followed weighing hard on my chest. He gazed at me for a considerable amount of time, his face displaying both anguish and comprehension. "It's true," he said. Not very loudly, but what does that signify for us? I had no response, and the idea of having to choose between Daniel and Gabriel seemed unfeasible, but I realized that hiding any longer wasn't sustainable. If we didn't take action right away, the truth would surface in a way that would wound everyone. With an honest response that was hardly audible above a whisper, I said, "I don't know yet." We must be honest with ourselves, though, and determine the meaning of whatever this is between us. Although it was difficult to ignore the grief in his eyes, Gabriel nodded. He approached me and took a seat next to me on the couch. His hand touched mine, and we sat there silently for a while, me leaning into him and laying my head on his shoulder as the weight of our predicament weighed heavily on us. "It would be nice if things were different." He said, "So do I," and I said, "But we can't pretend forever." We sat in the quiet of the living room for a while, and I could hear Daniel's voice on the phone coming in from the next room. It felt like the quiet before the inevitable storm, and I knew that eventually we would have to face it. The following morning, when Daniel left for work, I found myself standing in the kitchen with Gabriel, and the silence between us was filled with everything we hadn't yet discussed. I could feel the tension rising, the need to speak to decide what to do next, but the words wouldn't come. I suggested that we have a conversation. The hush was finally broken by Gabriel's solemn nod. "Indeed, that has been on my mind as well." As we sat at the kitchen table, the weight of our talk pressed down on us both. I took a big breath and tried, but failed, to order my thoughts. It all seemed so complicated and overpowering. "My affection is for Daniel." My voice began to tremble, but I can't deny what has been going on between us. Gabriel put his elbows on the table and leaned forward, saying, "I don't know how to reconcile that with my marriage to your father, Gabriel. I care about you, Gabriel, a lot. Not that I want to lose you, but I also don't want to hurt him." Either his remarks struck me hard or the corners of my eyes began to well up with tears. Even though I didn't want to lose him, I had to acknowledge that we couldn't keep going in this direction without everything collapsing. I said, "I think we need to take some time," slowly and with a trembling voice. "We need to figure out what this is without rushing into anything, and maybe that means stepping back for a while." Gabriel's face fell, and I could see the pain in his eyes. He repeated, "Stepping back," and I nodded passionately. Itching, "I believe that's the only way we can solve this. We cannot be certain of our feelings while concealing them from Daniel Gabriel." He remained silent for a considerable amount of time, his eyes focused on the table before him. I could see the conflict in his face, which was the same conflict I was feeling deep down. At last, he sighed and nodded slowly, saying softly, "Okay, if that's what you believe it to be." I didn't want to lose you, Gabriel, so I did my best to reach out and take his hand. We must, however, be truthful with one another and with ourselves. His eyes were filled with a mix of understanding and grief as he gazed up at me. "I don't want to lose you either, Charlotte, but if this is what we must do, I'll do it." I was exhausted after the talk, but I was also happy that we were recognizing the reality of our relationship and ceasing to act as though we were, as it was the first step in determining what followed. In the following days, Gabriel and I tried to keep our distance from each other in order to allow ourselves the time we needed to reflect, even if it wasn't going to be easy. The experience was uncomfortable and challenging, even though it was required. As I lay in bed that night, the house was quiet around me, and I felt a strange sense of peace. I had no idea what the future held, but I knew that we would face it together. Someday, we would need to make a decision, but for now, we were embracing each day as it came, navigating the complex emotions that had brought us to this point. I knew that no matter what happened, the bond between us, the connection we had, would remain even if it had to change. For the moment, that was sufficient since, although it wasn't flawless or simple, it was true.